we've shown no ability to deliver services in rural areas. I mean, in fact, we've done worse. So in some sense, I think it may be a good thing to give up on that fiction, to say that we essentially cannot deliver services very well in rural areas. Teachers don't want to stay there, health workers don't want to, rural attendance rates among health workers in health sub-centers in Udaipur district are now 30%. This is attendance rates. Rest of the centers closed. This set of services that the government claims to deliver in rural areas is constrained by the fact that nobody wants to live there. That's an equilibrium, because if I'm the health worker and I want to send my child to school and the teacher doesn't come to school, then I don't want to live there. And so everybody's exited, everybody lives in the nearest town, they round trip to the village, and this is the reverse round tripping for the government, and they show up once in a while. So the quality of service is really lousy in most of rural India. This has been widely documented. The ASAR results yesterday confirm entirely that fact. So in some ways, I think that if you look at a different vision for India, it would be a vision where we actually acknowledge that delivering services is extraordinarily difficult in rural areas, and therefore we actually move to a model where we say that, well, we can only deliver services in cities, and the consequence of that was a city like Meerut will need to, which is an extraordinarily unpleasant place to live if you're poor, because the infrastructure is bad, and in particular in Delhi at least there is the Vasant Vihar water line you can steal water from. In Meerut, even the middle classes don't get water very well, and so so you get this. So people basically at this point have a strategy often of going to Meerut, staying somewhere, maybe with a relative, maybe just sleeping in the shop where you're working, and going back to your village as soon as you can. Maybe a different model for India would be one where the city is actually a pleasanter place to live for the poor, and then the city has other advantage, like the advantage Edward is learning from others, or better schools, etc. And maybe the children of the poor will then be able to get that, and the government might be able to change its delivery strategy to emphasize what it can do, which is, I think, deliver not great, but much better services in urban areas. If it actually took that decision, I think this may well be both a useful and an interesting strategy.
Thank you. I want to start by basically saying it's a privilege to be able to do this with CPR. We've always admired CPR from afar, from way south in Bangalore, which is not a bad place to be given how incestuous Delhi is. So it's the opportunity to do a program and to begin the year and to do our first inaugural program with Ed coming and talking is it's a privilege for us. So Pratap and Partho, thank you very much for allowing us to do this. I have just one word for describing my reaction to your presentation, which is, phew, it was just breathtaking. For somebody who's an urban activist, an urban advocate, just listening to the range of ideas that you've put on the table for us to digest is just extraordinary. I don't think we can do justice to the topics that you've put on the table. 2 or 3 things that I wanted to just place here as reactions and to possibly get feedback, not only from you, but also from others on the panel. The first is, just as a context setter, this is probably extremely good timing. Many of us here, we have Dr. Mohanty from the government. He's the Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. He kind of anchors the flagship mission that we have in the country, and one half of it, which is on the housing and urban poverty alleviation side. From, by the way, his doctorate from Harvard, so Abhijit, hopefully he'll have some answers for your questions. But just from a broad timing standpoint, this question about urbanization in India, the question about the kind of issues that you've raised, I think couldn't be better timed. Over the next 5 to 10 years, these are questions we need to deal with, because fortunately we are still 28–30% urban, which means that if we can address these in a systematic, intelligent, coherent way, we can actually affect the lives of millions of people over the next 15 to 20 years as they inevitably will make their way to our cities and towns. So I think as a backdrop, this is You can't get something larger than this as a canvas against which we need to work. 3 particular points that came to mind. The first is data. The fact that everything you talked about was kind of filled and substantiated with evidence. I don't know how much of that. All of my observations, by the way, will be about India. I don't know how we can even begin to have the kind of conversations and the topics of discussion in India, because there's nothing here. What we have is innuendo, half-fact, fabricated realities, and kind of misleading conclusions. So I think that one probable takeaway is, if we can start creating the basis for collecting some of this data, begin maybe with a few lighthouse cities, and then do that systematically, engage policymakers, institutions, research houses, and so on. I think this is a mammoth exercise that certainly demands the best of the brains of India to get involved. So that's one thought. The second is, what are the implications of these patterns that you've seen from a policy and a governance standpoint? And I'm clubbing the two into two separate things. Policy as far as whether it could be federal or state, and certainly this is a question you can answer even in the US context. And from a governance standpoint, what does it mean for how we run our cities? Or are these kind of realities that take place through the confluence of so many out-of-control events that you really can't do much about it? As an example, if Detroit could see the writing on the wall of Ed Glaser's analysis, why is it not reinventing itself? And why is it not able to kind of capture the possibility of an ideas-based city? The third point is, if cities are also the bedrock of political energy and political change, we see little evidence of that here in India, at least now. As again, someone who's not an academic, I have learned that our independence movement, the energy for that started in our cities, but we see little evidence of that today. In fact, if anything, the urban Indian citizen is politically not only irrelevant, but made to feel irrelevant by, I think, the confluence of the political class, the media, and the intellectuals. So how do we get out of that sense of irrelevance and become politically energized again? So.
Okay, thank you, Ramesh. Arthur? Speak from the floor.
Thank you, Pradap. Where did you come from? This is fine. It's in recording. You can't get away from the camera. Ed, thank you so much. This was a very wide and expansive introduction to your thoughts. So it's a real pleasure to have you do it in person and with such vigor. I can see why the New York Times says what it does. The one sort of big picture question that came out of your talk, and then 4 small ones about India. The big picture question is, you speak of the gateless, gated city. And that to some extent seems to be related to the fact that the skill story in cities are growing. So at the same time, cities are also becoming much more service-based. And that same service spans across the whole spectrum. So you have the high-end services, the guys who work in the Wall Streets, and then you have the restaurants and the ushers and the whole lot that sort of service these people. So what does this evolution of not just the consumer city, but also sort of the service city mean for cities in person? And one of the specific issues is cities then become, in some sense, much more diverse economically, or rather in income-wise. So naturally becomes much more unequal in some sense, but also much more inclusive if you sort of look at the gating story, etc. So if you have some thoughts on how you think this movement, as the change in the consumption basket towards urban, sort of changes your view of the city. The second, now sort of move on to sort of specific things about India. One issue is this whole issue of the poor in the city. Now, Abhijit spoke about, can we do better for the poor in the city? And the question to my mind is, how does that square with the spatial equilibrium story? That in some senses, given that there is poor in the village, there seems to be two of necessity, by sheer virtue of continuity to run that special equilibrium story, to have places in the city that are horribly poor, especially from a city viewpoint. And sort of, they look much more horribly poor because they're contrasted with the richness that's also there in these cities. And in a sense that if any of these places were to become much better, then they would, the only way to do that is by keeping away people who would want to move in and stay in horrible conditions and still do well. So essentially having good stuff for the poor in the city, or rather minimum levels for poor in the city, essentially inherently